Good evening and welcome. The Minister for Social Security, Senator Fred Chaney, claims that the staff at 3 Melbourne Social Security offices tried to take over the premises yesterday. He claims that the staff and some irate clients intimidated managers. Police were eventually called to the North Fitzroy branch to have staff and clients removed. Senator Chaney says that if any such actions occur again, he'll invoke the powers of the controversial Commonwealth Employees Employment Provisions Act, known as SEEP, to stand down or dismiss staff. The dispute between staff and management over staffing levels has been running for several weeks. It deteriorated at the North Fitzroy branch yesterday. The manager refused to allow pension and unemployment checks to be issued because the staff working there were from another branch. The staff say they were only too willing to dispense checks, but were prevented. As it turned out, scores of people who came to collect their checks went away empty-handed and angry. Mari Moore spoke with some of them.
Margaret and I and this man here have been here since 10 o'clock this morning waiting for our check.
What kind of check is it?
This is an unemployment benefits check. Yeah. Now, I wouldn't mind so much if I wasn't $75 down on my rent, and I wouldn't mind so much if I had more clothes than what I got. Right? My jeans are ripped completely, and I don't mind showing you. There's the rip in my jeans, and you know, it's not nice.
I demanded to see the manager. I was first on the line. I sat upstairs for 2.5, 3 hours waiting to see him. He said he'd come and see me. He didn't. Instead, he came downstairs and spoke to everybody. He said he couldn't issue checks. That's a lie, because the staff have told me the checks have been signed. He just locked them in the safe. And the story is, right now, that there are people that work here normally that can do the job and can give people checks.
Can you afford to live?
My wife is in the hospital right now. I can't even get the tram to see her. She needs things like soap, detergent, whatever you need in hospital. You need a fair bit.
Haven't you got any money?
I have to get clothes. No, I've got nothing. I have to take, her clothes, wash them and take them back to her, what she wears in hospital.
We live in hostels. Us two live in a hostel, and Mark Brown.
And we come from the Salvation Army, and they say to us, go to the Salvation Army and get money. Now, we live there. Now, how can they say that to us when we know we're not going to get anything off there?
What kind of check are you on?
In pension.
Can you afford to live without the check?
I'm pregnant and my baby's getting fed on water.
You haven't got any milk at all?
Nothing at all, no.
She's been with me all day waiting.
Have you got any money at all?
No, I haven't, no. And all the clothes is what I've got on. I'm an old scrag.
Were you surprised to find out you couldn't get your check?
I was told this morning to come up and get it at 10:30 when I rang, and I would get it.
And what are you going to do?
I don't know. Eat dirt. That's just it. What are we supposed to do? What can we do about it?
Do you guys understand that there is an industrial dispute going on?
Yeah, but why should the public have to suffer for what they're doing? The staff have been really helpful. They've had they've had about 25 staff there all day saying, we're trying, and the manager's just sat up there and done nothing and said, I'm not doing anything all day. Right. All day.
We don't like it,
Protect himself.
What do you mean?
Well, he called the Victorian Police Force to get us out. And if they have to move people, they're going to have to drag them out.
Are you really angry about this?
Am I really angry? You've got no... of course I am. I'm violently angry.
Do you owe money too?
Yes, I'm going to be evicted out of the house. I mean, I got threatened last night to be thrown out by heavies.
If you got your check, could you afford to live there?
I could pay some of what I owe, yes.
Do you think that the government understands your stories?
No, I think it's terrible. I see why people sometimes commit suicide, because that's how I feel. But what about the little kids, the little ones that have to go hungry because these people are on strike? Why do the public have to suffer? That's what I want to know.
The staff at North Fitzroy say it was the manager's fault that no checks were handed over. They say the management deliberately tried to antagonise them by not allowing them to work. Mari Moore spoke with staff representative Lloyd Williams after he'd been evicted with his workmates.
We're trying to show them that we actually want to control this department for the beneficiaries. It is essential that these people who we serve, who are on the bottom rung of the social scale, who have no steady source of income, maintain some sort of income. We want to give that income to them. That's what we've been trying to do in that office today.
The people who are here to receive checks say that they haven't been given them. Are you willing to give them their checks?
Yes. Yes, we're definitely willing to give them their checks. We realise the serious plight that they're in. Unfortunately, the manager of this office has chosen to lock the cheques up in his safe.
But haven't you caused it because you're the ones that swapped offices?
No.
Well,
There's no difference.
That's right. I mean, the effect in the end is that we are in that office. We're willing to help those people, and these people are desperately in need of help, and we're capable of giving them that help, but we refuse the opportunity. Now, I admit it is a part of an industrial campaign to swap offices, but let's look at the basic issue of this, and that is that these people need help. We're willing to give it to them. We're on the spot to give it to them, and we refuse that opportunity.
Are you sorry that you changed offices now, that the people haven't got their cheques?
No, I think that we have to keep the pressure on management to get the increased staff that we need. Now, for the last 4 years, we've been trying to get increased staff, and we've withheld all industrial action.
But you're only hurting those people at the moment, aren't you?
Well, we're not. We're not the ones hurting them at all.
One man who's right in the middle of the dispute is Barry Cotter, the Secretary of the New South Wales branch of the Administrative and Clerical Officers Association. Avon Adams spoke to him today about the union's actions.
In yesterday's situation in Melbourne, where you had staff swapping offices and in fact locking managers out of offices, it seems to have got to the ridiculous.
Well, I think what Melbourne was about yesterday was our members showing up that there was in fact a lockout of them by management.
Isn't it about time this dispute was settled?
I couldn't agree more, and we've been saying that for weeks, but you can't settle a dispute when the parties aren't speaking. We've been making constant attempts to talk to Senator Cheney, and he has been saying, almost like a broken record, I will not talk to the union, I will not talk to the union. And he's been saying this for 6 months, and this was prior to stand-downs, it was prior to this dispute getting to the dramatic stage it's now at. So it gives us a lack of faith in his desire to settle the dispute.
Are you saying that the responsibility is in the ball's in his court now?
I think it has to be in his court. You've got an industrial dispute. You've got a dispute that he was warned of by his state director over 12 months ago.
But irrespective of how right you may be, the pensioners are the ones who are suffering. Isn't it time the whole thing was smoothed over and the pension cheques were sent out?
Look, I agree, and we've made a number of compromises over the last week. We've made concessions, significant concessions.
Like what?
Like doing the special computer run for Newcastle, like allowing 6,000 or 7,000 people to be paid, and effectively to bypass our own bans that 76 members had been stood down over. Our bans at no stage were aimed at harming beneficiaries. The government has stood down our members, and the government has therefore caused all this disruption by its own actions.
But hasn't it got to the stage now where it's just petty bickering between you and Senator Cheney?
I think there's a lot in what you're saying. There is petty bickering. It's a matter of Senator Cheney going out and making one set of claims and us going out and making another.
And in the meantime, the pensioners in the middle.
Well, they are in the middle, but the thing is, the pensioners are getting harmed 365 days a year because of the lousy service that the department can provide them. This dispute is aimed at bringing that to an end, and that's why our members have gone as far as they've gone.
Welcome back, and we're continuing the Social Security story. Before the break, we heard from Social Security clients, and we've had the views of employees and the Public Service Union. The responsible Minister, Senator Cheney, is in our Canberra studios. Minister, it's nice of you to give us your time on what is obviously a busy day. Mr. Cotter says that you say, almost like a broken record, I will not talk to the union. Do you say that?
What I've been saying, certainly since August, is that I'm happy to talk with the union when they cease industrial action in the department. They've refused to agree to that in New South Wales and Victoria. In the rest of Australia, the bans have been lifted and there are no problems.
It sounds, therefore, as though it's some sort of a standoff situation. You'll agree to talk to them when they go back to work. It's the standard arrangement in a strike. Isn't it time someone made a positive move?
It's a situation where for over a year, as was said earlier, there have been industrial moves being made in my department. During that time, we've tackled the matters which the union's been complaining about: staff ceilings, training and accommodation. We've made very significant progress, and yet the union has insisted on maintaining these bans. What you saw in your program a few minutes ago was very distressing, but your own interviewer put her finger on the problem. Those people who said they wanted to help those beneficiaries and pensioners were people who didn't go to work and do their job and issue the cheques. Instead, they went to somebody else's place of work. They deliberately swapped offices just to create a problem within the department. And Mr. Cotter, who was on your program a little while ago, last week tried to stop 250,000 pension cheques being printed in New South Wales. The ACOA got the computer operators to stop working when we still had 250,000 pension cheques for old age pensioners, widows and invalids to print. We had to bring them up to Canberra to get the work done. I really ask people to question the sincerity of people who are prepared to cut off payments to 250,000 people to make their industrial point. I'd stress that I'm prepared to talk to the union when they stop playing games.
Well, Senator, what's the situation today? Has there been any further development?
It's been a quiet day today, but after yesterday, when there was behaviour which I think was quite intolerable with the takeover of offices and indeed even physical intimidation, I've sent a message to the staff in New South Wales and Victoria saying that if that sort of behaviour is persisted with, then we will have to use the provisions of SEEP. I've given people until Monday to go back to work and do the job that they're paid to do. If they really want to help pensioners and beneficiaries, that's what they'll do. From the government's point of view, once that's done, we will happily deal with the union on the issues that they say are outstanding.
If they don't go back to work on Monday, will you start standing people down?
Yes, I've made that quite clear in the statement which went to members of the department today.
You would be aware, of course, that that would precipitate a national strike?
No, I think there are claims that that would be the case. I believe that there are very few unionists who can support the holding back of payments to some of the weakest people, the people who are most needy in the community. Thankfully, we've managed to keep the cheques running to the great mass of people who need them, and we intend to continue to do that. But it is the choice of individual unionists whether they are going to get in behind people like Mr. Cotter, who are prepared to try and block substantial numbers of payments to very needy people.
Do you regard the use of the SEEP Act as the last card in the pack?
I believe that we were right to, for the weeks that have passed, to have simply held a steady course. But when I saw what happened yesterday in Victoria, and when I looked at what has been done over the last week, when I looked at the fact that Mr. Cotter tried to stop 7,000 cheques going to the most difficult area, up there in the Newcastle area where people have been waiting for their cheques for weeks, and again we had to ask unionists to ignore his instruction not to print those cheques, which they did. When I look at that, I believe this dispute has gone far enough. We can't tolerate the department being treated as a toy by these people.
Without taking sides, let's hope that common sense prevails on Monday on both sides.
So too.
The way things are heading, we're going to get a bumpy ride into Christmas, a very bumpy ride. And it's no longer just a problem of getting the Christmas mail delivered. The postal and social security strikes are threatening to blow up and involve the jobs of thousands of other workers. And a number of other unions are now threatening to join the disputes. Tonight, the Communications Minister, Ian Sinclair, is all set to stand down 10,000 postal workers in New South Wales and Victoria. And the Prime Minister is threatening to use the SEEP Act to sack public servants in the Social Security Department. The government's already been using its powers under that Act to stand down social security workers. But the use of the Act is threatening to turn the whole thing round into a major test of strength now between the government and the public service unions. Well, the Prime Minister and the President of the ACTU are to meet tomorrow to try and find some way out of it all, but the government and the unions are so dug in already it won't be easy to find a face-saving device for either side. But in the meantime, how much longer can the strikers hold out right on the eve of Christmas like this? Well, today in Sydney we talked to some of the telecommunications workers who've been in dispute now for 3 weeks, and in Melbourne to social security workers who are in their 5th week of industrial strife.
The Social Security Office in Bayside St Kilda services the largest itinerant population in Victoria, with among the highest concentration of unemployed and pensioners on sickness or special benefits. When the 77 staff members learned that Nationwide wanted to hear their views, more than 30 took their lunch hour to support the ACOA line. 4 of their number have already been stood down under the provisions of the SEEP Act. They're being paid $40 a day from the union strike fund, and they and their colleagues say their morale and their militancy is undented. What's the relationship like with your senior management in the office at the moment?
Very bad.
Very bad?
Yes.
Was it good beforehand?
It was better beforehand, yes, much better.
Well, what do you think this dispute then has done to that relationship?
I'd say it's probably shattered it irreparably.
Would you all go along with that?
Yes, won't be the same again.
What about with your clients? What's your relationship like with them now?
Much better.
Good.
Much better? In what way?
They're all behind us.
They are supporting you, you say? There hasn't been any change in their attitude?
Once they realised it wasn't a pay dispute for high wages, they're quite in agreement with it. They come in every day and say, oh, you know, we really think you're doing a good job, keep at it, and you know, it's really good.
Before the dispute started, they didn't realise what problems we were working under, so therefore they'd get aggressive towards us because they just thought we were incompetent. Now they realise it's not just our problem, it's a problem facing the whole of Victoria, and they're showing some compassion and some patience with the situation here.
How far are you prepared to let this dispute run, though? I mean, it's been going on for 5 weeks now. How much longer are you prepared to confront the government?
As long as it takes.
But that may well be a long time. Do you really think that you can win against the government on this issue?
Yes. Well, hopefully, eventually. We're certainly going to try. They're already obviously worried for bringing in seats.
But then how far can you afford to go if you haven't got money coming in?
I don't think we're particularly worried about the money anymore. The principle's far more important.
The principle?
Well, the situation that we're under, we have to keep going. We need more staff. People that we work with have been seeped. And a combination of those two things means that we can't back down.
In Sydney today...
Determined, but so is the government, although no one from the government was prepared to discuss the industrial...
People that we work with have been seeped. And a combination of those two things means that we can't back down.
No one from the government was prepared to discuss the industrial crisis on the program tonight. Today we approached the Prime Minister, the Minister for Industrial Relations, Mr Viner, the Minister for Social Security, Senator Chaney, the Minister for Communications, Mr Sinclair. None of them was available to appear on the program tonight. The opposition spokesman on industrial matters, Bob Hawke, is. Mr Hawke, in the circumstances, isn't there an argument for the government making use of the SEEP Act, a situation in which you've got public servants taking over departments, as we've just seen there?
Well, I don't think there is, Peter, whether you look at it as a matter of principle or in a matter of effectiveness. In terms of a matter of principle, I'd just remind you that the International Labour Organisation in 1979, the tripartite body, condemned the SEEP legislation when it considered it and asked the government not to proclaim it. So there is an independent international tripartite condemnation of the legislation.
But you can't stand by and let public servants be a law unto themselves, surely.
I said there were two things, Peter. There's that as a matter of principle and objective judgment. The second thing is that if you say you can justify it, as your question is implying, on the basis that it will produce a result, I would suggest to you, on the basis of my experience, that it will not cure the problem. It won't fix it. It will make it worse. So the reason for using it, in your judgment, it seems to me, falls to the ground. It won't work. It'll make it worse. And just let me make some points about the range of disputes, which I think are relevant, and which...
I've got another question before we move off this.
Sure.
If you're in government, you can't stand by and let public servants take over departments and installations.
If we were in government, the situation would not have arisen.
It's very easy to say that.
Well,
but if you have a situation as we have now...
You don't have to take the role of the four ministers who won't be here. Let me put the position as I see it. The first point I want to make is this, that I want to make some suggestions which I think can resolve it, because I don't like seeing the public inconvenienced, and particularly at this time of the year, as they are. Now, what do we do about it? And there are two disputes that you've been mainly mentioning. Let's look at them. Firstly, the Social Security one. Now there, the union and their members over a very, very long period of time have been asking the government to give more staff so that they can provide adequate service. The government has refused to meet with the union, and the independent evidence, I suggest, that the staff have a good case is in two parts. Firstly, you will have seen in the media yesterday that 40 senior staff people, not the people who are on strike, but 40 senior staff in the Social Security Department have written to the Minister and have published their letter saying that the staff's claim is justified and that there should be more staff. Now that's, if you like, a judgment from people in a position to know.
So does the government then turn around and say, all right, the staff in that department say, we need more staff, they must have more staff?
What I suggest ought to happen at this stage, and I believe this is the way in which it ought to be resolved, is that the government on its part says, all right, we recognise that you may have a case. Don't let's concede the lot, that you may have a case. The letter from the 40 senior management staff seems to suggest that you have. So we as a government will indicate that you may have a case, and in indication of our good faith that we want to talk to you about that, we will withdraw all threats of SEEP and stand down and suspension. we ask you in turn to lift all your bans and we sit down and talk. Now, that meets, I think, legitimately the integrity of both sides, and then the things can get back to normal, the discussion can be held, and I believe that out of that discussion, whether they have some independent chairman or not, I think out of that there will be a recognition of the need for more staff, and that will be done.
Yes, but look, you know, that's almost hypothetical. What if you don't get that sort of recognition out of it?
You can't get it unless you try. That's the simple answer. Now, the alternatives you've got are going on with a situation which the Combined Pensioners Association, by resolution at the beginning of this week, said they supported the staff. That's the Combined Pensioners Association said they know from their experience that there's a need for more staff. Now, there's independent judgments about the legitimacy of the claim. Now, I don't like it going on the way it is, so what I'm suggesting constructively is that there's a way through of fixing it and meeting the problem. I'm not bending over to the union, and I'm not trying to kick the government in the teeth. I'm suggesting a constructive way in which it can be fixed up.
Yeah, but
now,
look, a matter of principle, surely it's an important matter of principle. No government can have public servants telling it how many people should be in an individual
department.
department.
The union for months and months and months have been asking the government, before they took any direct action of the magnitude they're taking now, they said, look, we've got a problem about staffing, will you sit down and talk with us? And the government wouldn't. It's not something that they've just pulled on last night or the week before last. They've been trying to get the talks and the government wouldn't hold the talks. Now, I'm not prejudging. I think prima facie the union has got a case, but I'm not saying to the government, cave in. I'm just saying, well, you move a bit, and I would say to the union, you move, you lift your bands and sit down and talk, and I think it can be honourably resolved.
Today voted to continue its action against the Department of Social Security. That means the work bans will stay on, and workers who've been stood down will report to work each day. It's likely union members in other departments will be asked to become involved in the dispute. Workers are seeking additional staff in the Social Security Department.
The Security Department voted to return to work tomorrow. The members of the Administrative and Clerical Officers Association and the Public Service Association also decided to step up their campaign of rolling stoppages. Mike Sutherland reporting.
The meeting of members of both unions at the Dallas Brooks Hall voted for the unions to continue redeploying staff between department offices to help officers with the biggest backlog of claims. The unions are seeking an immediate 3% increase in staff and an independent inquiry into the department's staffing levels. The ACOA will also call a meeting of all its members in Victoria to consider action in support of their colleagues in the Department of Social Security. The Union State Secretary, Mr David Bunn, says other ACOA members will probably give the dispute financial support and warned that if the federal government used the controversial KEEP Act, which allows public servants to be sacked over industrial action, all ACOA members were likely to take industrial action.
Certainly we'll be looking for financial support. And as you know, there's now a story abroad that the KEEP legislation may be used soon against Social Security members, and we'd be erecting in advance, hopefully, if we hold a meeting next week in advance of the use of KEEP, we'd be erecting some branch statement on what the rest of the membership would do if KEEP were used.
After the meeting at the Dallas Brooks Hall, about 400 workers marched on the Department State headquarters in Lonsdale Street, where they met with the Department State Director. In Melbourne, this is Mike Sutherland reporting.
The scenes inside the North Fitzroy Social Security office this afternoon when police were called to evict staff from the premises. Earlier, the manager had tried to lock out staff, but they let themselves in with their own keys. Today's attempted sit-in is part of a continuing campaign by Social Security office workers for higher staff ceilings. Quentin Fogarty reports.
The manager attempted the lockout when he discovered that most of his staff intended to swap jobs for the afternoon with their workmates at Coburg. It was a show of strength by the workers, and I was told that they took the action to prove that they, and not the management, are running the offices. When the Coburg staff turned up and were let in by their workmates, the manager said he wouldn't be paying out any social security checks, and he called police to clear the office. Some youngsters who had been waiting most of the day for their unemployment checks reacted angrily.
I'm not cutting off your dole. I will give you your checks as soon as I possibly can.
They're in your money safe upstairs.
They are not in my safe.
They are. You hold the key to that safe.
I do not hold. I've got the key to the safe.
You have locked that safe. You set up there. There's people going in here with little kids, 3 and 4, asking for money so they can feed their kids, and he just refused. He's been sitting up in his office all afternoon doing absolutely nothing.
The unemployed youngsters said they were determined to occupy the building until they were given their checks or were thrown out. However, while they were outside talking to the news media, the manager locked the door and police escorted staff out by a back entrance. Just after 5 o'clock, it was all over. Those young people who spent most of the day waiting around for their checks say they'll stay around for a short time tonight to make their presence felt, and they'll be back in the morning to try and get their checks then. Quentin Fogarty, National 9 News.
Joy on our industrial scene tonight. Mail services are at a virtual standstill, and we could soon be facing another prolonged stoppage by the nation's metal workers. But in the most menacing dispute, a confrontation between the federal government and Social Security Department workers now seems inevitable. Industrial reporter Norm Beeman says this follows the move today to invoke the CEEP Act to stem disruptive tactics.
The move by Senator Cheney to invoke the controversial CEEP Act is expected to bring the Social Security dispute to a head on Monday. During this long-running row, workers have been refusing to carry out certain duties in protest at a lack of staff. Senator Cheney has now ordered that, as from Monday, any Social Security officer who disrupts work or intimidates any officer who is working is to be immediately stood down.
Our members have demonstrated 3-4 times in the last 2 years that they resent this act, whether it's used against our members or members of other unions. It will be, in fact, I think, difficult for the officials of the union to hold them back from what could be a confrontation.
I believe that we cannot give way to the sort of behaviour we've had over the last few weeks, and particularly over the last few days. We cannot tolerate a situation where members of this union walk away from a computer that's about to print 250,000 pension cheques. We cannot withstand that sort of behaviour. We've just got to keep going.
Workers and the federal government are set on a collision course over industrial action in support of more staff. Today, Social Security Minister Senator Cheney warned that troublemakers in the department would be stood down under the Commonwealth Employees Act. Already, the union has indicated that such action could prompt a statewide strike. This would mean a complete halt to the distribution of Social Security payments.
The dispute over a shortage of staff has been a nagging problem in the department since October last year. But it's only been in the past month since staff was stood down that real trouble has erupted. At some branches, employees have gone so far as to attempt to take over the managerial running of offices. Late yesterday afternoon, the issue came to a head. It was this incident at the North Fitzroy branch that prompted Social Security Minister Senator Cheney to issue telexes to Social Security officers. In the message, the minister warned that any employee involved in disruptive action or refused to work would be dealt with by the Commonwealth Employees Act. The controversial act allows the government to stand down employees involved in industrial action.
If there's any further action, CEEP will be used. People who are currently stood down have until Monday to come back to work.
Obviously, the Administrative and Clerical Officers Association is strongly opposed to the action taken by the minister. In fact, they've gone so far as to accuse the senator of aggravating a confrontation.
I've got no doubt about that. The fact that he started standing people down at the beginning of November was in itself a signal that he wanted something like all-out warfare.
This afternoon, representatives of Social Security branches met to discuss the minister's warning and to work out the course of action once the government invokes the act, most probably on Monday. Already there's strong feelings that a statewide strike may be called, a move that would throw the distribution of security payments into chaos. Shane Mooney, National 9 News.
Still on industrial news, and the federal government has begun standing down Social Security employees under the controversial Commonwealth Employees Act. So far, 273 officers have been suspended, 231 of them in New South Wales. The union at the centre of the dispute, the Administrative and Clerical Officers Association, has responded quickly to the government's action with a claim that the Act has been incorrectly invoked, and it sought a directive from its legal advisers over Supreme Court action against the government.
The much publicised act was brought into being at midday. Here in Victoria, 42 officers have been stood down. The action followed an earlier warning by Social Security Minister Senator Fred Cheney that unless there was an improvement in the long-standing dispute over staff ceilings, the act would be invoked. The union in the centre of the dispute, the Administrative and Clerical Officers Association, has been quick to respond. In New South Wales, legal action is underway to stop the stand-downs, while in Victoria, a mass meeting has been organised for Wednesday morning at the Sydney Myer Music Bowl.
Speaking with my New South Wales counterpart, I think we've coordinated an approach that we'll be recommending a return to work on Thursday morning. That is something like a half-day stoppage.
Here in Victoria, stand-downs have taken place at 6 Social Security offices. By far, the hardest hit branch is this one at Moonee Ponds, where 10 staff members have been suspended. A further 3 of their colleagues were also stood down after going out in sympathy. Under the Act, the workers will remain off the job until the dispute is settled. Even then, it's up to the government to decide whether the officers get their jobs back. Although the federal government and the union can't see eye to eye on staff ceilings, one point they do agree on is that pension cheques due on December the 19th will be paid on that date, despite any industrial action. Shane Mooney, National 9 News.
Federal government departments are grinding to a halt around Australia tonight. Thousands of public servants are on strike in New South Wales and South Australia. Thousands more will strike here on Friday, and other states are likely to follow. The industrial situation is at a flashpoint as the government continues to threaten workers with suspension under its controversial SEEP legislation. Use of that law to suspend workers in the Social Security Department after a long-running dispute over staffing shortages has led to the strike crisis, as John Wiseman reports.
Public servants' anger at suspension of hundreds of social security workers sparked an immediate strike in New South Wales. Thousands of workers marched through the city and staged a mass demonstration. They'd refused to go back to work from stop-work meetings, ignoring recommendations for a national stoppage on Friday and deciding instead to strike until next Monday. Here in Melbourne, government offices were left only partially manned as an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 public servants walked off the job. It was a taste of things to come. At their mass meeting, members of 2 public service unions decided they'd strike for 24 hours from midnight tomorrow. The strike is to show support for suspended social security workers and to show that use of suspension provisions of the controversial Commonwealth Employees Employment Provisions Act won't be tolerated. About 18,000 workers will be on strike.
The 2 unions have very considerable coverage of the potential membership, and there will be many offices either deserted or nearly deserted on Friday.
That won't be the case, though, at social security offices. That department alone will be virtually unaffected. Although it's at the centre of the issue which has led to Friday's strike, social security staff will stay on the job. They'll be there because they don't want the issue that's led to the present blow-up lost sight of. That is, their claims that there's a drastic shortage of personnel in the Social Security Department, and they don't want to hurt people reliant on social welfare payments. So, in Victoria at least, most welfare recipients will continue to get their money.
Well, the vast bulk of payments are being processed almost on time from our information. Now, we can't vouch for other parts of the process of distribution that our members are not involved in, but to the extent that we control that process, there are very few delays. But the vast bulk of people who've come to rely on welfare checks are being paid.
There's no chance of the government backing down in the face of the public service dispute. That's the word from Prime Minister Fraser at a news conference in Perth. He says the government will enforce its stand, and if the union continues, more workers will be laid off.
I think it's something which, it's really an appalling industrial tactic. Senator Cheney has acted over the last few weeks with firmness, as he's had to, but at the same time with a very real degree of restraint. But the union has, or a few members of the union have pushed and pushed, and there's not the slightest doubt that we've had to take the action we have, and if there are to be continuing work bans and limitations in relation to the normal work of the department, upon which the welfare of tens of thousands of needy Australians depend, of all ages, then there'll be just more and more people stood down under the SEEP Act.
Public servants in New South Wales and Victoria today decided on strike action in support of their colleagues in the Department of Social Security. Under the SEEP Act, the federal government has stood down almost 4...
SEEP Act. Here in Melbourne, more than 4,000 federal government workers voted to stop work for 24 hours on Friday. But the workers in the centre of the dispute, those employed in social security offices, will not take part in the strike. As public servants were meeting across the country, Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser again warned that more public servants will be suspended if the strike spreads.
The decision to strike from midnight tomorrow night came at the end of a 3-hour meeting at the Sydney Myer Music Bowl. No longer is the dispute confined to the Administrative and Clerical Officers Association, but rather now takes in the Australian Public Service Association. Recommendations hotly debated by members and later carried included a declaration opposing the government's use of the SEEP Act and a 24-hour stoppage on Friday. An amendment left the way open for social security workers, the centre of the dispute, to decide themselves whether to take part in strike action.
That suggestion came about because social security members are perceived as gaining growing public support for their staffing claim, and they're also seen as having a genuine concern to get those payments out. Now,
After the major meeting broke up, a smaller meeting was held consisting of members of the Social Security Department only. At that meeting, they decided to accept the offer open to them and refrain from taking strike action on Friday. The strike will mean disruptions in numerous government departments, including taxation, telecom business offices, customs, education, Commonwealth Employment Service and Veteran Affairs. Broadly speaking, any Commonwealth government office in contact with the public. With public servants in 3 states voting on strike action, attention now centres on the federal government. In Perth today, Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser warned that the government was keeping open its option of standing down more workers under the SEEP Act.
There is support from other Commonwealth departments of the same kind. Bans and limitations preventing normal work being done. Then they'll also be I said use the word stood down. The correct word was suspended under the SEEP Act.
For a wage rise of service to its knees. 500 members of the Administrative and Clerical Officers Association involved in the dispute have been stood down. And after the announcement that the government was implementing the SEEP Act, about 6,000 members in New South Wales have gone on strike until Monday. Today, about 50,000 public servants attended stop work meetings and went out in protest at the government's use of SEEP. Public servants in 3 states today voted to take industrial action. Western Australian and Tasmanian public servants are expected to meet later in the week. The situation has reached confrontation point between the Fraser government and public servants. Today, Avon Adams spoke to the Shadow Minister for Industrial Relations, Mr. Bob Hawke, about the dispute.
What's your reaction to the use of the SEEP Act in general?
Well, my reaction is the same as the International Labour Organisation. That's an international tripartite body made up of employers, governments and central trade union movements from all around the world. The SEEP legislation was referred to the Freedom of Association Committee of the International Labour Organisation, and in November of 1978 the ILO condemned the legislation and asked the government not to proclaim it. Now, that was a totally independent tripartite judgment, and I think it was a right judgment.
So you abhor the legislation, do you?
Well, it's against the principles of the ILO, against the principles of its conventions, and that's why the ILO condemned it and asked the government not to utilise it. And if you leave questions of principle aside, which I think are important anyway, but put them aside, it just doesn't work. It prolongs disputes, it doesn't settle them.
Well, the Prime Minister has said that he won't back down, that he still has the dismissal clause up his sleeve. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I've had a reasonably long experience in industrial disputes, and I know that this sort of action doesn't solve the problem either in the short term or certainly in the long term. And the thing should be played politics with. Neither side has behaved perfectly in the dispute. That's quite clear. Now, the time surely has come where the interests of the general public are taken into account and the 2 sides sit down and talk.
If the dismissal clauses were introduced, how do you see the situation responding?
Well, it must get worse then because you're going to have more people in the public service who may not have been immediately involved, but who will tend, I think, to take stands of principle in regard to that as a separate issue.
That already seems to have happened. You've got a situation where 400 ACOA members have been stood down, at least 6,000 have gone out until Monday, and 50,000 public servants went out today to process the whole action.
Yeah. Well, as I say, that's what you'd tend to expect.
Well, how practical is it to stand down thousands or hundreds of thousands of public servants?
Well, as I say, I won't settle it in the either the short or the long term. I mean, from the government's view, and the most optimistic scenario in one sense would be that they could threaten them all into going back to work. But what sort of workforce have you got when they go back? It's not going to be working efficiently. You don't run affairs that way, not in my judgment.
Couldn't it be argued, though, that the government must have some gun to fire under threat of industrial action by unions?
That's not the only weapon in their armoury. There are plenty of guns there. I just make the point that guns don't settle industrial disputes.
I should point out at this stage that we invited the Prime Minister, Mr. Fraser, to join us on the programme tonight. He was unable to do so because he's been very busy, flying back from Perth today and arriving in Canberra, and as I understand it, going straight from Canberra Airport to Government House to have consultations with the Governor-General. Ken Begg is in our Canberra studios. Ken, why did he go to Government House?
Well, Mike, he stood you up tonight for a very good reason. It's his 25th wedding anniversary, and the Prime Minister went out to Government House to report to the Governor-General, which is a regular thing that he does, and now he's back at the lodge, as I understand it, having a quiet evening at home, celebrating his 25th wedding anniversary with one of his children and Mrs. Fraser. So I'm sure no offence was meant.
That's as good a reason as any for being turned down. I've heard of a lot worse over the years. Let's get down to what it's all about. Why is the Prime Minister taking on the public service unions at the moment?
Well, the Prime Minister is a hardliner in industrial relations, and let's make no mistake about it, the person who makes the decisions on industrial relations in Canberra is Malcolm Fraser. But the issue of who's running the country was often the theme cry when dealing with the trade unions. This time it's who's running the department. And these are the words the Prime Minister used at a press conference in Perth today. He believes that the officers who are engaged in work bans in the Department of Social Security are doing so because they want to run the department. He says the government's not going to cop this, it's not going to be seen as weak or compliant, it can't tolerate this sort of interference, and it will stand down or suspend those public servants who take them on. So it is a confrontation issue. The government sees its credibility or reputation threatened, and it's taking a tough line. And the Prime Minister also made clear that if it's necessary, they'll stand down more. So we do have a classic confrontation scenario.
Now, your point that he said he'll stand down more, he also made the point, as I recall in Perth today or last night, that he has that further ace up his sleeve of the ability, under the CPAC, to sack people.
Yes,
Would he contemplate doing that?
Well, quite clearly, the Prime Minister is prepared to consider that as an option. He said so, again, at his press conference in Perth today, that should it become necessary, the government, to use his words, would not shrink from that option. So clearly, it's a threat, but quite clearly, the Prime Minister would use it. They have stood down, as you said in the introduction to this item, more than 500 public servants, and he indicated that they'd stand down more in other departments if they went out on sympathy. So clearly, they are prepared to sack them. But to what end? That's difficult to say. Again, all I can say is that the Prime Minister is a hardliner, does not want to be seen as weak, and is obviously prepared to wear the effects of a full frontal industrial dispute within the public service.
Well, it appears that both sides have now painted themselves into a corner where neither side's prepared to talk to the other. Would a government, would Malcolm Fraser, despite being a hardliner, sack one public servant and have every one of the rest of them walk out?
I think if it came to the crunch, one should never underestimate Malcolm Fraser's toughness. He's often been described as being as tough as old boots, and he is. He's a very tough man. But I think he's also got a fine political antenna. He's still leader. And I think he would consider very carefully before sacking any public servants, because possibly that would lead to an all-out onslaught by the public service. But if they push him, and if the Prime Minister believes it's important enough, and politically it's an issue that he can win, he'd sack people.
Ken, it's an issue that he's obviously intent on winning, but I don't understand the timing. If there was an election 6 months away or something like that, but he's got a long time before any question of going to the people, why is the timing as it is now?
I can only guess at that, Mike. I can guess that each year Australians generally are subjected to, around Christmas time, a spate of strikes that are designed to inconvenience the public, if you like, and it's also designed to allow trade unions who feel they have legitimate claims to press them with the most devastating effect. And I think perhaps that the Prime Minister's mood may be reflected by people out there in the community who tend to become a little frustrated at the constant round of strikes. It hasn't been a great year for Malcolm Fraser. Perhaps he's also looking at scoring a few points before the end of the year. Perhaps he sees this as a watershed, that you can't give in to your own public servants, you have to be tough. Difficult to say, but I would suspect it's a battle that he intends to win.
One before you go, why has he called a special two-day cabinet meeting next week?
I think it's the end of the year wrap-up, Mike. There's a lot of things before cabinet. We've got to look at protection for the car industry. We may possibly have to look at dismissal of public servants involved in this social security strike. We've got a whole stack of issues. We've got to look at HMS Inevitable or Insipid or Invincible, the aircraft carrier. So it's got to be all tidied up, and I think the Prime Minister would like to get 2 days of cabinet underway next week and, as I understand it, go fishing or go on holidays with the family over Christmas.
What is it when you've celebrated 25 years of marriage? What anniversary is that?
Mike, I haven't celebrated 25 years. That's
but come on, you're the font of all knowledge.
Not the font of all marital knowledge, Mike. I don't know. Maybe it's a silver spoon or a wooden glove.
We're going to have to leave it at that and wish the Prime Minister the best 25 years after having walked down the aisle with Mrs. Fraser. Thanks a lot, Ken. Good night to you, and we'll return very shortly.
The social security dispute have ended in Canberra without a breakthrough. However, the president of the ACTU, Mr Dolan, who met for 2 hours with the Prime Minister, Mr Fraser, left Parliament House saying some progress had been made. The details from Barry Cassidy in Canberra.
It seemed here in Canberra today that one way or another, everybody was involved in a dispute. The Prime Minister, Mr Fraser, for example, had to drive himself from the Lodge to Parliament House because his driver had been stood down in another dispute involving transport workers. He became the latest victim of the CPAC. And the ACTU President, Mr Dolan, who came here to solve one dispute, found himself in the middle of another. The ACTU yesterday placed a ban on commercial television stations after they followed a group of demonstrators into a closed ACTU executive meeting. And today, Mr Dolan was determined that ban would remain.
Will you speak to us after the meeting, Mr Dolan?
However, Mr Dolan did talk to the rest of the media. The trip to Canberra, he said, had been worthwhile. Although there was no breakthrough, some progress had been made. Mr Dolan said he would be meeting at the weekend with the ACOA, the Public Servants Union, at the centre of the dispute, and he hoped to report back to Mr Fraser early next week.
The proposal I put has not been completely accepted by the Prime Minister, I suppose, nor has the proposal he put back to me. But as I say, I do believe some progress has been made, and I really can't say any more than that.
So it sounds as if there is room for compromise between the two proposals?
Yes, I can go so far as to say that.
Will there be an early end of the dispute, within a week?
Oh, I'm not making any predictions about when the dispute may end. That will depend very much on the discussions that will take place over the next couple of days.
So the dispute will drag on until early next week at least, but if nothing else, today's talks appear to have put a stop to further stand-downs in the meantime. In Canberra, Barry Cassidy.
Clerks employed by the Social Security Department today lifted their work bans after a stormy mass meeting at Dallas Brooks Hall. After the meeting, Union Secretary David Bunn bitterly attacked Social Security Minister Senator Fred Chaney and warned that there could be an all-out strike by public servants early next year.
Today's meeting follows a 14-month campaign by social security workers to have staff numbers increased. Two unions, the ACOA and the APSA, say that since 1975 the number of people receiving social security payments has increased by 39%, but staff numbers have risen by only 19%. In short, the union says there's a need for 1,000 more jobs to be created. In support of this campaign, the unions imposed a series of bans that have seen more than 400 of their numbers stood down in Victoria and New South Wales. Today, the members face three alternatives: maintain the bans, remove them, or go on strike. After a very heated debate that went on for more than 4 hours, it was decided to remove the bans.
The decision to remove the bans was carried by a very small margin. In fact, 400 people voted, and the decision was only carried by 40 votes. Afterwards, it was a very emotional Union Secretary, David Bunn, who addressed the media.
The problem is that the people we're dealing with are liars, con merchants and cheats. No, we don't really expect anything better of them than that this time. What we've said today is we're going to duck. They're wielding a very large bludgeon. We're going to duck, but by God, we'll be back there.
On the job today in New South Wales and Victoria, they're expected to work overtime to clear the backlog of payments from their 5-week dispute. The clerks voted to lift all their work bans yesterday, as Daryl Hutchison reports.
The motion considered by the meeting listed the prospect of no resolution in the dispute before Christmas as one reason for the return to work, and the desperate plight of beneficiaries as another. Although speakers at the meeting admitted that to pass the motion would be to lose the dispute, there was much self-congratulation for what they described as putting up a good fight against the Fraser government. When it came to the vote, a very large majority supported the return to work proposal, leaving the next step to Social Security Minister Fred Chaney.
The Senator has now got to put his money where his mouth is, so to speak, and come good with the promises he made about negotiations and reviews on staffing levels.
Now the staff say they'll do their best to get checks out by Christmas, and they voted to meet again in late January. Daryl Hutchison, Eyewitness News.